I'm going to start by asking you, why did you come? What about this topic spoke to you?
Everything.
Everything. Because we have lots of experience with trying to get our children to do things. And when I say children, it's little kids, it's teenagers, it even applies to adult children as well. Can you actually tell a child to do anything at all? It reminds me a little bit of a story that Herman Wouk, the author, he once had an audience, a personal meeting with the Rebbe. And in the course of that meeting, one of the things that the Rebbe told him is that you cannot tell American Jews to do a thing, but you can inspire them to do anything. And I think it's a good place to start, because it's that feeling that we should be able to tell people what to do and then they should listen that actually ends up frustrating us a lot. I don't know, like I say, why are you here? Let's contextualize and just get a little bit of experience and perspective, and then see what the wisdom of Judaism has to say about it. So what's it like trying to get your kids to listen? So everybody's always going to say, oh no, it's fine, it's easy. My children are angels.
Depends on the day.
Depends on the day.
Depends on the country.
Depends on the country.
If you're English, you listen.
Not anymore.
No, but
Not anymore.
You do. Yeah.
But I'm going to say it also depends on the topic.
They're bossy.
Depends on the subject matter, right? Depends on what it is that you want your child to do.
Depends on how much leverage you have.
Depends on how much. That's true. Depends how much leverage you have. That's absolutely true.
It depends on how
For
you
example,
brought them up.
have you ever heard the story of the mother who changes the Wi-Fi password and you only get the new password when you've done your chores? That's leverage
That's correct.
in today's world. That's leverage.
I guess, yeah.
So it's true. Having leverage is definitely a big factor. Have you ever had a child say something along the lines of, because different children say it in different ways, but something along the lines of, "You're not my boss," or "You're not the boss of me." That's how children say it. "You're not the boss of me. You're not going to tell me what to do." And then at some point they grow to the stage where they say, not only "You're not the boss of me," they say, "Why don't you first get it right yourself? You're telling me not to be on the phone, but in the meantime you're on the phone." Like those kinds of conversations. Or you tell me not to get upset, but you get upset, and so on and so forth. So there are many, many, many aspects that come into play in this conversation around telling our children what to do. So I think that these are the things that often come up in our experience of trying to deal with children. There's the pushback. It depends what the context is. Like I said, it depends what leverage you have. It depends what it is that you're trying to get them to do. How's about some success stories? Because we often, in these conversations, we tend to talk about what's not working or where we're feeling the pressure. How's about some good news story? Like, this is where I did it and it actually worked. And my kids got on board with what it is that I wanted them to do. So what was the secret? What did you do that got them there?
Lead by example.
Lead by example. I think that's really, really powerful and very difficult. It's very powerful because at the end of the day, like the line that I once heard, "Who you are speaks so loudly that I cannot hear what you have to say." So if a person models a particular kind of behavior and then screams and shouts that you should behave in a different way, you don't stand a chance. So lead by example is a really, really powerful concept. In Torah, we call it a dugma chaya, a living example. So not just leading by example, but living in a particular way that your children want to emulate. And ultimately, that's the most powerful way to get our kids to do anything. It's not so simple. It's not simple for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we want to tell our children, don't do the things I did. Maybe you should be better than I was. Or don't learn from my mistakes. Learn from my mistakes. Don't emulate my mistakes. Well, sometimes our kids are just dealing with things that we did not have to deal with. So we don't even know how to lead by example. For example, this whole new technological reality that our children live with. You've got to sit with your child at the table and say, when I was your age, we used to have to look things up in an encyclopedia. We used to go to the library and actually look at an encyclopedia. It's not helpful to a child to tell them that. I mean, it's maybe a little bit of interesting trivia about their parents. It doesn't necessarily help them to deal with what it is that they're dealing with. And if you are still living with a certain, for example, taking notes in an actual book, right, as an example, that's not a living example. That's not a leading by example for your children, because that's not their reality anymore. So sometimes the things that we do, which we believe are going to be setting an example for them, may or may not work in the way that we expect, right? So that's just an interesting perspective. We think we've got this. We think we know what we're role modeling, not realizing that it could be completely out of their reality. So it's just an important consideration. But I do agree that in principle, leading by example is far more impactful and successful than leading by instruction. Very important. It's kind of the difference between demanding and commanding respect. It's a similar kind of thing. Okay, anything else? Any other insights, success principles that you could share? You know, we're trying to crowdsource our parenting over here. Everybody gets involved, shares something, and all together we build up a principle of how we should bring up our children.
I think it's also usually if you open the conversation, not just say do this, and you open the conversation and there's a bit of back and forth, and you give them a chance to say why they feel they don't have to do, and then you can actually get somewhere. I find that can.
Okay, so that's such an interesting point, because there was a time where children were supposed to be seen and not heard. And there was an expectation that if a parent or any authority figure or any older person said something, there was an expectation that the child would just conform and just accept it. And what's the expression I heard this week? Never heard it before. Suck it up, buttercup. Right? That you basically just got to take it, whether you like it or not. And it doesn't work in today's world. I don't know if it's necessarily a Jewish means of parenting. We can analyze that, maybe subject for a conversation in its own right. But in today's world, it really doesn't fly anymore. You can't just tell a child what to do. Whereas if you open the conversation and you have a healthy conversation, so I think that's important to consider, not just to have a conversation, but to have a healthy conversation, then you stand a chance of actually getting them on your side, as opposed to just saying, these are the rules. And as you know, how did we say it the other day? As long as you live under this roof, you're going to have to conform to these rules. So that doesn't necessarily fly anymore.
Don't you feel that we live in a worse society now than we used to? We have less manners. We don't. We're not brought up as well as we used to be brought up.
It's such an interesting question, and I've debated this a number of times with different people, some who've been quite offended by my position on it, as maybe you'll end up being now. And that is this notion that we live in a society that is worse because children have less manners. I don't know if that's so simple. So if you're talking about a lack of respect, that's definitely a problem, and it definitely seems to be a problem that is increased. In other words, lack of respect in today's world is more prevalent than it was previously. I'll often use the example that when I first started out, I'm not in this business for that long, okay? But when I first started out as a rabbi, nobody would dare to use vulgar language in front of me. And there's a certain generation that still, till today, would never, in fact, they would be offended on my behalf if somebody else used vulgar language in front of me. Then we evolved to the point where people would let a word slip out and they'd say, "Ooh, sorry, Rabbi, I shouldn't have said that in front of you." But now, there are people who are quite comfortable to use vulgar language right to my face. Not calling me vulgar words, obviously, but I'm saying in their course of conversation without apologizing for it. So that illustrates a very rapid decline in terms of sensitivity and, as you say, good behavior or good manners. And similarly, the notion of standing up and offering your seat to somebody who's older than you has definitely eroded in our society. However, there's another side to it, and that is just manners alone. I know the cliche says manners maketh man, but that's not necessarily true, because there were certain societies that had a tremendous sense of respect and, well, they were well-mannered and they spoke in a very, appropriate fashion, etc., etc. Morning. And then they went off, and then those societies went off to murder millions of people. So it's not as straightforward as that. You know, some of the most polished individuals ended up being some of the worst human beings. Whereas in a more casual society, so there's a balance that we need to find over here. In a more casual society, when there's more openness, like you're saying, conversations, that it's not just this top-down hierarchy, you actually engage with your children, you actually speak to your children, may well produce, on the one hand, people who are rough around the edges, but on the other hand, people who maybe are a little bit more open to real issues. So the example that I often use is, would I prefer, when I'm walking into one of our Jewish day schools, would I prefer the students to tip their hat and say, "Good morning, sir," or what I actually get when I walk through the shul, which is, how's it rov? Because the one implies that there's a level of, again, it's not intended disrespectfully. It's intended to illustrate that there's a level of comfort that we have with the rabbi. It's not an aloof personality. So I think there's a lot to unpack, just specifically in the context of manners specifically. So I don't disagree that there's a decline in terms of how people behave. And then we've got to test if all of that is necessarily bad, which is an interesting conversation in its own right. So what we try and do always in these conversations is, so present a concept, test a little bit of how the concept is in our own lives, which is this: how do you actually tell your children to do something and then they want to listen? Because that's one of our great challenges consistently throughout our lives. So sometimes we're tearing our hair out because I've told you. Have you ever used this line or some variation of the line? I've told you 1,000,000 times, or whatever it is. Because effectively what we're illustrating is, I don't understand why I'm not getting through to you. I keep telling you, put your stuff in the laundry basket, put your dish in the sink, don't talk that way to your sister, or whatever it is. We've got these things that consistently we're saying, and we get frustrated, but I've told you, and I've told you, and I've told you, and I've told you, and it feels like nothing's going in. I just want to say, you can't always tell what goes in and what does not go in until many years later. Just something important to keep in mind. Very often at the time, it seems like we're getting nowhere, and then one day they turn around as adults and they're actually decent human beings, and you feel, wow, okay, I must have got something right over here. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. We shouldn't wrap ourselves over the knuckles too soon, because sometimes things emerge. So what we always do is put out the subject, get a little bit of insight, a little bit of feedback, personal experience, and then try and find a model in the Torah that will help us deal with this particular issue. And there'll be many, many models within the Torah, but this particular one is not going to be the model of a human parent and child. Rather, it's going to be a template, again, similar to what we did last week, of looking at something in terms of how Hashem treats us, because obviously however Hashem treats us is teaching us how we should treat others as well. Now, it's not always exactly the same, obviously, because Hashem and us is not the same as us and other people. Obviously, we don't play the God role, even in our own families. But there's a lot to learn from it. So if it feels like we're going off topic, that's just because we're building a case that we're going to bring back and then apply it to the topic. Because that's how we have to do it. We've got to mine our resources of real wisdom and eternal wisdom in this case, because it's the Torah's wisdom, and then bring that back into our lives. Okay? So, where is the first occasion that Hashem tells us, the Jewish people, how to behave? Okay, that's not the Jewish people. Okay, it's a good point. It's not the Jewish people. So the Ten Commandments, okay? I think that's the most generic. Obviously, everybody embraces the Ten Commandments in some way or another. Everybody sees it as this pivotal part of the whole Jewish experience. We know that it's very early on in the development of the nation. So therefore, that's probably the best place to start in terms of Hashem telling us what to do. Okay, I know it sounds weird to use that expression about God, but that's what it is. That's what a commandment is. It's telling us what to do, right? At Mount Sinai. So, and then of course everybody always says, yes, of course, Rabbi, I'm not that religious, but I keep the 10 Commandments. People often say that. I always say to them, have you read them? Because maybe you don't want to say that you're keeping the 10 Commandments until you actually read what they say. In everybody's minds, they keep the 10 Commandments because they believe in God and they haven't murdered anybody recently. So that's considered, keeping the 10 Commandments. There's other things as well, like honoring your parents and keeping Shabbos and not coveting what other people have, which in the age of social media is almost impossible. Hey, it's just one of the 10 Commandments, not to be jealous of somebody else's Instagram feed. So it's not that simple when people say that they keep the 10 Commandments. In any event, that's the first time that we have Hashem telling us anything, right? As a nation. Obviously, as individuals, there are many examples, and there were even instructions that were relevant to the nation, but they were given to individuals. Like Hashem tells Moshe how the Jews have to prepare to leave Egypt, and they're going to take the Pesach sacrifice, etc., etc. That's to an individual, for the nation. This is the first time he's addressing us as the group and saying, I am Hashem, your God, and these are the things that I'm telling you to do. So that's the first time you can say that Hashem is essentially telling us what to do. Okay? How much do we know about the story? I'm not saying how much is written in the Torah, but how much do we know about the story? Can we piece together a chronology of the event where Hashem told us the 10 Commandments? Can we do that together? We'll do it collaboratively. Let's create a chronology of what happened when Hashem gave us the Torah. And I'll tell you why we're doing this. Because if we're just going to keep it highly generic and say, Hashem told us what to do, without any context of how he did it, then we don't have any wisdom for how we should tell anybody else what to do, especially those people we're responsible for, which is first and foremost our children. So it's going to be useful for us to create the fuller picture, not just some generic Mount Sinai 10 Commandments picture. So let's start building a chronology over here. What happened? When does the story begin? Where does the story begin? How does the story begin? What did they have to do in the run-up to the giving of the Torah? How did Hashem give us the Torah? What was the experience like for the Jewish people themselves? Let's just piece it together as if we were, I guess, scripting almost like a documentary of the 10 Commandments. So where would you say it starts? Leaving Egypt, right? Leaving Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt. That's where everybody would say it starts, right? So you leave Egypt, which very much is like that line. I used this line last week also. You know, the mother who wags her finger at her child and says, I brought you into this world and I'll take you out of it. So Hashem starts by saying, I took you out of Egypt. Now you're going to have to listen to what I have to say. Because that's the first of the 10 Commandments. I'm Hashem, your God, who took you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So that's surely where the story begins. Right? It begins with the story of the Exodus. Okay, so they leave Egypt, and then what happens? It's not a test, by the way. We're just collaborating over here. You shouldn't feel any pressure. Do what?
We were in the desert. Or you mean, you're talking about it like actually...
No, I'm just saying chronologically. Okay, so leaving Egypt is the first point of our chronology. What's the next major milestone of the chronology? The splitting of the sea. Right? It's the next major milestone of the chronology, which effectively is still part of the story of the Exodus, because until they get to the sea and drown the Egyptians, there's still the potential of the Egyptian army chasing and recapturing them. So they're only really free once they've split the sea. Great. This is the easy part. Everybody knows the first 7 days of the Exodus, from when they leave until the sea splits. But from there until they receive the Torah, still another 6 weeks. What happens in those 6 weeks? What key things happen in those 6 weeks?
They run out of food.
They run out of food.
water.
So let's reverse it. First, they have an issue with water. The first issue that they have is water. They arrive at a place called Marah. It's the very next thing that the Torah tells us after the splitting of the sea. They arrive at a place called Marah. Food they could carry for weeks, but you can't really carry fresh water. They didn't have the sterilization processes and whatever that we have now. They needed to have a water source wherever they went. So they get to this place called Marah. And in this place called Marah, they find that the water there is undrinkable. The Torah calls it bitter waters, right? It's undrinkable waters. And then they've got to somehow purify the water. So they don't know what to do. And Hashem tells Moshe that he should cut down this tree and drop it into the lake or the oasis, whatever it was. And they will then purify the water so that they can drink it. Okay, so that's the next major event that happens in the story. It's a good event. It's not what we're going to focus on now, but it's a good event for understanding how a person goes from a slavery mentality to a Torah-oriented mentality. You first got to go through some kind of bitter waters, which basically means you got to get that bitter taste of what's not healthy in your life so that you can appreciate the healthy taste of what is healthy in your life, which also is a parenting hack, by the way, that sometimes you have to let children make mistakes so they can actually feel that it wasn't comfortable, that it wasn't useful, and that's how they grow. Sometimes you got to do that. It's like when you allow your child to walk, you're obviously allowing them to fall. That's part of that kind of process. Okay, then they run out of food, which is a major, major issue for the Jewish people. As we well know, Jews have a love affair with food. You can well imagine. I mean, forget about being in the desert with no food. We know what it's like to be on an airline where they don't bring the kosher meal, or to go to a wedding and they can't supply a second helping of the pierogim that's supposed to go in the soup, and everybody has a whole meltdown because we have this love affair with food. So you can imagine what it must have been in the desert to totally run out of food. And there's a crisis, and Hashem resolves the crisis and he gives them the manna. And the manna is also an incredibly powerful lesson about life in general. It's the lesson that Hashem will provide, and that we have to have that kind of trust and faith. And there's a lot we could learn from the manna about trust and faith. Great. Okay, so now they've got food and they've got water. Now what happens? The Egyptians are gone. They've got their food and water. By the way, there is also the ambush of the nation of Amalek that happens at that point. So there's this vulnerability that's exposed very early on. Here you thought you were safe because you got rid of one set of problems, but now you're ambushed by another set of problems. Great spiritual lesson there too. But let's go further because we're trying to get to Mount Sinai, right? So, and I've just given you a big clue, right? We're trying to get to Mount Sinai. So So that means that the next part of the story must include travel.
Traveling on.
You've got to travel on, right, in order to get first to the Sinai desert and then to the foot of Mount Sinai. So that's how the Torah describes it. It was on Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month of Sivan, which is now into their third month since the Exodus. They arrive in a place called Midbar Sinai, the Sinai desert. And then they proceed to the mountain. And the Torah tells us that the entire Jewish people camps with absolute unity at the foot of Mount Sinai. We are now T-3, 3 days before the giving of the Torah. And this is the part that we're going to start to focus on. 3 days before the giving of the Torah, what did they do now? Because we have the impression, if you don't pay attention to the story, we have the impression that they're just kind of waiting. They're waiting, doing nothing for the Torah to be given, for this great event. But that's not accurate. There are certain things that happen during that period of time. So we want to just pick out some of those things that are happening at that period of time. 3 days before the Torah is given. Anybody have any idea what's going on in the camp at that time, besides obviously all the whispered rumors, because there had to have been Jews who told the other Jews that they had the inside track and knew exactly what was going to happen, and they had to be, right? I mean, they were not fundamentally different to how we are today in terms of the Jewish psychology. So there were clearly people saying, I heard this and I heard that, and it was rumors and whatever. But what do you think was actually going on in the camp? So the Torah tells us
We had the mixed multitude.
they don't really play a role yet. They're going to play a role after the Torah is given. At this point in time, they're a silent minority. We don't hear about them. They're not doing anything. What we are told, the Torah tells us the following things. First of all, everybody had to immerse in water in preparation to receive the Torah. Basically, a mikveh. In fact, it's probably the first record we have of anybody immersing in a mikveh. Hashem tells them clearly that they had to immerse not only themselves, but their garments as well, as a preparation to receive the Torah. So that's very interesting, and one of the main reasons it's so interesting is because immersion in a mikveh is one of the key elements of becoming a convert to Judaism. Up until this point, they're not Jewish. This is going to be part of how they become Jewish. So part of it would have been having a bris. They had to circumcise their children just before they left Egypt. And the other part is immersing in the mikveh. And then the third part will be accepting Hashem's authority and the mitzvahs that are associated with it, which is going to happen at the time of the giving of the Torah. So they have to go into the mikveh, they have to immerse. The other thing that we're told is Moshe is instructed to put a cordon around Mount Sinai. So when the action happens on the 6th of Sivan, this is now, we're talking events that happen on the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th of Sivan, when it gets to the 6th of Sivan, and there's going to be this great light and sound show, and Hashem's going to present the Torah, nobody is allowed anywhere close to the mountain. So they have to cordon off the mountain. And Hashem tells them in advance, at the end of the whole thing, there'll be the sound of a shofar. And when the sound of the shofar ends, then you can remove the cordon and people can resume whatever they want to do on the mountain, if anybody wants to approach the mountain. So these are the preparation steps that we're told that they had to do. And then we're told, obviously, Moshe's got to go up the mountain. Obviously, right? He's got to go up onto the mountain. So Moshe goes up onto the mountain. Before he goes onto the mountain, the Torah tells us that Hashem descends onto the mountain. We don't know what that looks like. We do know that around the experience of Hashem descending onto the mountain, there's a thick cloud. The mountain actually catches a light. So there's fire, there's lightning, there's thunder, there's the sound of a shofar. There's a lot of drama. And then there's the presentation of the Torah itself, which is a very, very powerful experience. In fact, it's such a powerful experience, we're told, that initially, when they heard the first 2 of the 10 commandments, it was so overwhelming and it was so powerful that their souls actually left their bodies. This is a very important part of the story, so pay attention. A very important part of the story. Their souls left their bodies, and their bodies were flung back a distance of 12 kilometers. And then Hashem had to send down angels to bring the bodies back and to use the special dew of resurrection, that's what it's called, the dew of resurrection, to bring people back to life. And then Moshe takes over and he tells the rest of the commandments. Moshe then stays on the mountain, as we well know, for 40 days and 40 nights. That's when we're going to run into the debacle of the golden calf. Then he'll come down, he'll address the issue of the golden calf, he'll punish, that's where you have the mixed multitude, he'll punish the perpetrators, then he'll go back onto the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, asking Hashem to forgive the Jewish people. Then he'll come back, go back a third time for 40 days and 40 nights. And during that period, Hashem will teach him a lot more information of what the Torah has to offer. And then he'll return with the second tablet. This is already now on Yom Kippur, so this is quite a lot later. and with the forgiveness for the Jewish people. But the second tablets will also be accompanied by much more information that he could teach than what he originally taught them at the first of the first set of the commandments. Okay, so you got a timeline? Okay, here's where I'm going to throw a spanner in the works. That timeline that we've just gone through was all discussed in last week's parasha. Last week's Torah portion is called Yisroi. It's all about the giving of the Torah in all of this detail, and a little bit more detail than what I've included. They had to build an altar afterwards. The fact that they asked Moshe to speak instead of Hashem because they couldn't handle it. All that information is in last week's parasha. This week's parasha, you'll excuse me saying this, but many people find very boring. After the drama of last week, this big revelation at Sinai, and the whole place is trembling and vibrating, and the divine voice comes at them from all different angles, and there's thunder and lightning and all these things. You open up this week's parasha, it's like, oh my gosh. It's just law after law after law after law. And the parasha is called, for that reason, Mishpatim, which means the laws. And it makes sense, because last week you had the presentation, and this week, you're getting the details of the presentation, which is effectively exactly, let's say, like a person who has a book launch, and now you've got to read the book. Or a product launch, and now you've got to find out how the product works. That's effectively what's happened. So last week was this big light and sound show, very exciting. And this week is, I'm sorry to say, for many people, a very boring parasha. And here's the saddest part of it. Because people find it technical and boring, do not murder, how you deal with financial issues, what happens if somebody kidnaps, the laws of slavery, which we don't relate to because there is no slavery in our world today, the laws of personal injury, the laws of responsibility if you do damage, if your animal does damage, what happens if somebody breaks into your house, self-defense. Okay, maybe that's a little bit more interesting. But a lot of these laws are technical, and honestly, unless you're that way inclined, they're not that exciting. So the unfortunate and the sad part of it is a lot of people run out of steam before they get to the end of the parasha, which, believe it or not, is dramatic again. And I'm telling you now that most people don't even know that part of the parasha exists. Right at the end of the parasha, it tells us a whole lot of detail about what happened before they got the Torah. For example, it tells us that everybody heard that Hashem's going to present us with the Torah and said in unison, Na'aseh v'nishma. You heard that phrase before, right? Na'aseh v'nishma. The single most powerful phrase that the Jewish people used in the context of getting the Torah. We will do whatever Hashem says, and then nishma, we will listen and hear all of the details. Surely, we should have heard that in last week's parasha. Surely. It's a critical part of the story. It's a part of the story telling us that they are committed. And it's the precursor, surely, to receiving the Torah. The fact that they were committed, surely that's the reason Hashem gave us the Torah? No? Also, in this week's parasha, we read about Sefer HaBris. That literally Moshe, and I'm telling you again, 90% of Jewish people do not even know that this happened. Moshe wrote a contract between the Jews and God. It's called Sefer HaBris, the book of the covenant, of our commitment to Hashem. When did that occur? Before the Torah was given. Not only that, but they had to bring this series of communal sacrifices, and then Moshe had to take the blood of that sacrifice and sprinkle it out over the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant between you and Hashem, which happened when? Before the Torah was given. And then, in the end of this week's parasha, it tells us, and Moshe went up the mountain, which was obviously before the Torah was given. So if you're writing a book, this does not work. You don't start the story, then go to the next chapter, and then in the following chapter, go back to how the story began. It seems really strange. And all the commentaries try and rack their brains to come up with an explanation of why this is presented in such a weird, choppy, lack of chronological order. Now, the Torah is not always chronological. That's something you have to know. It's not written as a history book. And there are occasions where things do jump back and forth. But wherever the Torah does something that is not chronological, it's because there's a really good reason for it. Which means there's got to be a really good reason for this. But this is not simply not chronological. This is confusing. Start the story, then you tell me the next part of the story, then you tell me the laws, which are no longer part of the story. That's actually part of the information that is contained in the book. And then you go back to part of the story that belongs right at the beginning. It's very choppy. It's very difficult to follow. And the greatest proof for that is how many people don't even know about this part of the story, because it's all the way wedged at the end of another whole parasha later. People don't even know that it happened. You tell me, how many people here knew that there was a document written between Moshe and the Jewish people committing them to the giving of the Torah before the Torah was given? Have you ever heard of this before? 90% of people have never heard of it before. Did you know about this business of sprinkling the blood as an indication of their commitment? Did you? No. Never heard of it, right? Okay, Naasev and Ishma, we've all heard that phrase, but none of us realize that it's only written in the Torah so much later. In fact, I can guarantee you that every single year, without fail, there is somewhere in the world at least one child who sits there looking at the parasha of the giving the Torah and saying, where's the Naasev and Ishma part? We just learnt about that at school. Where is it? Why isn't the Torah not telling me? And they're typically not there next week at the end of the parasha to hear that that's where it gets inserted. So it's so strange. Why is it doing this? And like I say, all the commentaries try and offer different explanations and angles on why it is. We're going to focus on the explanation that the Rebbe gives, because this explanation has great insight for us. Because this is the first time Hashem tells the Jewish people what to do. So it's got great insight for us when it comes to telling our children what to do. Sometimes the Torah does things out of chronology, because the Torah is not a history book, as I already mentioned. And by the way, if it is a history book, boy, does it do a poor job of being a history book. Have you ever thought about this? Let's just quickly see how good the history is in the Torah. How long did Adam live? 930 years. 930 years. How much airtime does Adam's story get in the Torah? Now, I'm sure a lot of things happen in 930 years. How much airtime does his story get? One parasha. One parasha out of 53. To cover the span of almost 1,000 years. How long were the Jews in the desert? 40 years. How much airtime does the 40 years in the desert get? 3.5 books of the Torah. That's not a history book. It's clearly a book that is focusing on what is relevant for us, so we know how to behave as Jewish people. And that's actually the meaning of the word Torah. What does Torah mean? People often say law, right? It means what?
Understanding.
Understanding doesn't mean understanding. That
To?
You mean like to see. There's no aleph. Aleph would be to see. But think of another word that just change the first letter of the word Torah, and you'll have a word that helps. Think of being in school.
Mora.
Exactly. A mora is a teacher. So Torah is instruction. Teachings. That's what it is. It's not history. It's not even philosophy. It's instruction. So whatever parts are included in the Torah are there to give us instruction. And the way that they're included in the Torah is to give us the details of how those instructions work. So here we've got this really pivotal moment in the whole story of the Jewish people, the giving of the Torah, so to speak, the first time that Hashem is telling us what to do with our lives. And the fact that it is split up into these disconnected pieces is for a very, very important reason. Very important reason. And the key to that reason is, why do you think Hashem overwhelmed us when he gave the first two commandments? In other words, do you think what happened was Hashem's like, okay, I'm so excited. I want to tell them our Torah. I've been waiting for thousands of years to do this. I want to tell them the Torah. Boom, he tells us the Torah and they say, oops, that was a bit too intense. Okay, let's try it again. We're going to tell them the next commandment. That was too intense. And then the people say to Moshe, Moshe, maybe you should rather represent us. And Moshe says to Hashem, I think I should represent. Hashem says, you know what? That's a good idea. Do you honestly think that that's what happened? In other words, is it possible that Hashem could not foresee, by virtue of the fact that he designed us, you don't think he could foresee that this would overwhelm us?
Yes, he must.
He must have, right? So why did he do it? Knowing that it's going to totally, obliterate us, why does he do that? He what?
He wanted us to listen, to understand, and to...
Oh, so you just said two different things. To listen and to understand. They're not the same. No, but that's a very important point, right? To listen and to understand they're not the same. So at this point, what did he want us to do? To listen.
To hear.
No, to listen.
Listen.
To hear means to understand. That's going to be the next phase. To listen. Listen just means you just get the information. Download the information. In other words, if you really want to unpack it, the story of giving the Torah is a story in two parts. Not two chronological parts, but two mechanisms that Hashem is using. And the reason it has to be in two parts is because the Torah is supposed to achieve something which is impossible. It's impossible to bring infinite divine reality into the human world. That's impossible. Doesn't make any sense. So if you want to achieve the impossible, then you need to have two mechanisms that you use. So if you ever feel that trying to get a message through to your children is impossible, that's got nothing compared to Hashem trying to get his message through to his children, because that's really impossible. By every metric, that is impossible. You know, just to use an illustration that we could all relate to, you go overseas, you buy a beautiful appliance in the United States. We've used this example in the Tanya Shir. You come back here to South Africa, plug it in, and kaboom. Because our voltage is too high for those appliances. Now, if you're the manufacturer, then you know right from the start how much voltage to use for that particular appliance. So if God is the manufacturer of human beings, he knows how much we can handle, and he knows that this is impossible. There is no way to insert full-blown, infinite, divine energy into humans. Cannot work. They are going to fry. It's going to destroy the system. And yet he does it anyway. And yet he does it anyway. That's the first mechanism. But then there's a second mechanism. And if you don't have the second mechanism, then the first mechanism was a complete waste of time. Now, we haven't yet worked out what the value is or what the objective is of the first mechanism. We haven't got there yet. But one thing's for sure. If you have the first mechanism without the second mechanism, you're wasting your time. So let's think for a moment, what's the second mechanism? The first mechanism is Hashem's going to blast us with infinite power that we cannot handle. How that works, we're still going to explore. What's the second mechanism? Say that again, sorry?
He uses a medium.
He uses a medium, right? Which is Moshe, right? That's true. And that's 100% true. And we've got to drill down into that and say, it's not just simply that he uses a medium. Something else has to happen. So there's a midrash. The midrash says, once upon a time, there was a particular place, or two places, it calls them Roimi and Surya, but I think for us, we'll go back to the good old East and West Berlin. Once upon a time, people from East Berlin could not enter West Berlin, and vice versa. There was a big, great wall that divided the two of them. Says the Midrash, one day the king says, let's tear down the wall, and let's allow the citizens of the two sides to meet and to cross-pollinate and to connect with each other. So the Midrash says the same kind of thing happened at the time of the giving of the Torah, because initially the way that Hashem designed the world was, Hashomayim shomayim la Hashem, as King David says in Tehillim, the heavens belong to Hashem, v'ha'aretz nasan livnei Adam, and earth belongs to humans. And the implication was that never the twain shall meet. There's no way to translate the infinity of heaven into the experience of the world, and there's no way that you could elevate the world to be able to handle what heaven has to offer. So the objective of the Torah was to remove that barrier, and the Midrash concludes its comments by saying, va'ani hamaschil, Hashem says, I'm going to go first. I'll do the first step of breaking down that wall, and then you're going to have to do the next step. And the Midrash relates that to the verses, because the verses say Hashem descended onto the mountain, that's Hashem pushing through the barrier, and Moshe climbing the mountain as the mediator. Moshe has to rise to meet Hashem. And Moshe is the representative of the Jewish people, so that implies that the Jewish people have to rise as well. In other words, there are two mechanisms to the giving of the Torah. There's Hashem giving us instruction, and there's us committing to that instruction. So Hashem giving the instruction is, you need to go to the mikveh, cordon off the mountain, and now I'm going to tell you what to do. Us committing to that instruction is Naseh v'nishma, signing a document, so to speak, of understanding or of commitment to Hashem, having this covenant, this blood covenant that Moshe is supposed to do. Moshe climbing the mountain. The reason the Torah splits these two things is not because it's trying to confuse us with a chronology. It's telling us something much more important. You need two stages to be able to transfer divine information to human beings, which in turn will be a template for how we transfer our values to little human beings. So what are the two stages? The first stage is you have to present something that, unfortunately, not only can they not understand and appreciate, but it has to completely break the recipient. That's what Hashem's doing to us. In other words, before we got to Sinai, we were slaves. We had a slave mentality. And a slave mentality does not just mean that you don't feel a sense of independence. A slave mentality means that you don't see a way to self-actualization. That's what a slave is. I am going to be dictated to by others. Others either as people or as the norms of society or the expectations of society. I don't have a voice. That's a slave mentality. If we extend that into the parenting metaphor, children by nature have a slave mentality, which means, not God forbid that they're slaves, but a child doesn't have the maturity to self-actualize, to appreciate values. You can't leave it to them to work out on their own. And when I say children, that includes teenagers. We know scientifically that the last part of the brain to develop properly is the frontal cortex, which only matures in a person's 20s, sometimes even closer to 30, which means you don't have the maturity to make value judgments until you're a little bit older. So children are, in a sense, slave mentality, which means not slave in the sense that they're bad people, in the sense that they're trapped, but in the sense that they don't have the development to appreciate what is truly valuable in life.
Yeah, they can't grasp it.
They can't, right? They absolutely can't. In the same way as the Jewish people standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, they cannot grasp the possibility of this incredible growth journey that Hashem is going to offer them through the Torah. They don't imagine that. Forget about whether they believe or not, if they could do it. They don't understand, they don't appreciate that such a reality can even exist. Which, by the way, is not so far-fetched. Can happen to any one of us in our lives. We can get completely trapped in the norms of society and believe that life begins and ends with cappuccinos and brand label clothing. And we don't recognize that there's a possibility of a whole different me, a whole different greatness, we don't realize that. So at some point, a person has to crack. At some point, a person has to break that shell and stop living in that small little place. So that's why Hashem comes and he blasts us. He blasts us with this laser beam of divine energy, not because he wants us to, God forbid, be harmed, to the contrary, because he wants to shatter the old self so we can open ourselves to a new reality. And sometimes that's what happens, and it's a little brutal to go through. But to be able to be shaken out of our comfort zone, to address the possibility of something else, is jarring. Like the seed has to crack in order to grow. Like the child has to go through the turmoil of adolescence in order to emerge as a mature adult. Like the caterpillar that becomes a butterfly. There has to be some kind of movement away from an old limiting self in order to become a new, mature, meaningful self.
Metamorphose.
Exactly. And that's our responsibility as the teachers and the parents. Because if we're going to mollycoddle a child and just allow them to do what they feel comfortable with, or get away with the things that they enjoy, or follow the path of least resistance, that is no favor to our child. So our responsibility is to create a sense of discomfort in their lives. Not to create a sense of pain, but to create a sense of discomfort, which says, I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to challenge you to do something you don't enjoy doing. I'm going to challenge you to have some discipline. I'm going to challenge you to go to sleep at a certain time, to make your lunch, to put the dishes in the dishwasher, to do your homework when you don't feel like doing your homework, to learn something that you don't necessarily feel like learning, to attend shul even if you want to run outside and play all over. My responsibility as the parent is actually to shatter a little bit of that structure that you're living in, which feels very comfortable to you because you don't know any differently. But I know that there's a whole lot more that life has to offer. The thing, though, is, and this is why the story is so important, if it's only what I give and direct to the child, like Hashem giving us the Torah, or telling us how to manage the mountain, or telling us how to prepare, and there's none of our reciprocal involvement, there's none of us coming forward of our own volition and saying, Naaseh v'nishma, we're going to do this, or coming forward and saying, we're going to make a covenant, then we haven't taught anything. And the great way to illustrate this is, when the Jews left onto their next journey, Mount Sinai was no longer a monument. There's nothing till today. There's no pilgrimage to Sinai. There's nothing. because you cannot imbue meaning if it's only what you're presenting. So at Mount Sinai, it's all about what God presented. Well, that cannot last. Whereas the Jews go off on their journeys and they then go and build a Mishkan and they create a space for Hashem, that's their contribution. And that's really the trick. The trick is that things only consolidate, that values are only truly transmitted when we reach the point that the child, in our case with Hashem, we're the child, that we start to recognize, Amen. We don't know what the journey looks like. We don't expect the child to understand the maturity or the life experience that we have. But what we do want is that sense of their recognition, there's value here. And that ultimately is the goal of what we're trying to do as parents. In the same way as the goal of what Hashem wanted to do with the Jewish people was to first blast them with something which would completely change their perspective on life, but then allow them to step into the role, allow them to make the covenant, allow them to say Naaseh v'Nishma, allow them to build a Mishkan tabernacle. And that's what we have to try to do with our children. Guide and then allow them, give them a voice, invite them to have an opportunity, allow them to express their willingness, their interest. In other words, we've got to coach them rather than instruct them. If we instruct them and say, this is what you do, good chance that at some point they'll resent it and they'll probably rebel against it. But if we coach them to say, do you see, like you were saying, you have this conversation, do you see the value? Do you understand? Do you want to know why I believe these things? Do you know why I think this is good for you? Bring them into the story so that they start to contribute to their own growth and their own development as well, that they start to feel a value of connection, then we stand a chance. So you cannot tell a child to do anything. That's the reality. Because as long as I'm telling a child to do anything, it's my value system. And there's no reason in the world why somebody should have to follow my value system. But once we inspire a child and help to open their eyes by explaining, by learning with them, by talking openly with them, by addressing their questions, because one of the things that unfortunately happens is we often dismiss the questions. By addressing the questions, by giving them a voice. That's a whole chapter in the Torah. That's a whole section of how the Torah was given, is the voice of the people. The people stepping up to the plate. The people trying to recognize and learn this on their own. It's a coaching of children that gets them to where they should be, much more than an instructing of children. And that's a really valuable thing that we should, as much as we can, try and remember. Our job is not to dictate. Our job is to cultivate. Our job is to coach. Our job is to bring them on side. Our job is to answer their questions. Our job is to give them insight and appreciation so that, yes, we'll always push them outside of what they're ready to do, but we want to also push them to start to learn and appreciate it from their perspective, because we want them to own values, not to follow values. And if a child owns our values, it will firstly give us the greatest satisfaction. There's nothing like seeing your child outside of your control, so to speak, when they're older, sharing the values that you hold so dear, and realizing that they got there because they felt drawn to it rather than pushed to it. I'm saying it's more than just, unfortunately, we can't just model and expect they're going to work it out. We have to coach. And that's really our role as parents, to be able to coach children, to engage them, to discuss things with them. I once heard, for example, it's unrelated to this specific point, but I just thought it was such a brilliant thing that years ago, I heard a guy talking about how you keep your children safe on the internet. And what he suggested, which I thought was brilliant, is that the very first time that your child goes online should be a shared experience between parent and child. In other words, you sit down with the child and you show them, this is Google, this is how you search, this is the kind of results you can get, these are the things you need to be wary of. And the same would be with social media, like that kind of concept. Instead of what parents typically do, which is, you can't go onto those sites, you can't do those things. I don't like, you actually coach the child through it, because we know this is an inescapable reality. They are going to be exposed to the internet. They are going to be exposed to social media. So the job is to coach them, to go with them. And that's really, really the point. We can't rely on the fact that just because we say that something is the way to do it, that our children are going to buy into that. Whereas if we work with them and coach and guide and encourage them through those processes, then we stand a chance, obviously.